Welcome to our webinar this Friday morning. Happy US Independence Day for anybody with associations across the Atlantic. Today, we are going to be discussing the point, is continual improvement at an end? I'm Stephen Power and myself, Ian Jolliffe, are going to be going through this, ably supported by our technical whiz, Kirsty, across the desk. So, without any further ado, we will kick off. If you have any questions throughout this webinar, please feel free to post them in the chat and we will try and get to them as we go through. If not, we have allowed time at the end for us to review them. So, Industry Forum, just a quick potted history of who we are and how we came about. We were about 15 years in the making. Originally, back in the 1980s, the early 1980s, the UK government of the time had determined that UK manufacturing was not as competitive as it had once been and was in a dangerous position when compared with competition around the world. So it embarked on a benchmarking activity looking at the UK automotive supply chain versus its Japanese contemporaries in terms of quality, cost and delivery. The feedback from that benchmarking demonstrated that we were significantly behind the Japanese, all in terms of quality, cost and delivery, which led the government to bring across manufacturing from the Japanese automotive guys to the UK. So we had Honda, Nissan and Toyota set up in the UK, and they started assembling vehicles in the 1980s, 1990s. The problem was they were assembling vehicles that had basically all the components had been made from their Far East supply chain instead of the UK and European supply chain. So the reason for this was, in the view of the Japanese, the UK supply chain wasn't capable. It wasn't able to produce the quality that was required at the cost that was required and with the delivery parameters. So a second benchmarking study was conducted in the 1990s, which again compared UK and Japan in terms of quality, cost and delivery, but also included North America and other European countries. Bit of good news and bad news. The good news was we had actually improved from where we were originally benchmarked in the 1980s. The bad news was Japan had improved even more. So even though we had improved, we'd fallen further behind. And indeed, we came towards the bottom of every measurable output in terms of quality, cost and delivery when compared to our European contemporaries and those of North America. So following that, in the 1990s, in 1996, Industry Forum was established. With, at the time, an unprecedented event. We were supported by the Japanese Automotive Manufacturers Association, who combined with our SMMT, the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, and they loaned us business improvement experts from Honda, Nissan and Toyota. Now, this was the only time that these guys had worked together inside or outside of Japan, so it was a big deal. They stayed with us for 15 years. Their goal, their aim was to train UK engineers in business improvement, and those engineers would then go into the UK supply chains in order to improve performance there. The whole remit of our business was founded around helping businesses to help themselves, give them the tools and techniques and the knowledge and the understanding and the capability to make the improvements that were required. That ultimately ended up with our business focusing on business improvement. So we don't just jump in looking at Six Sigma, Lean, Kaizen. We look at what the business needs. We assess the strategy, the new product introduction, inbound logistics, outbound logistics, a lot of focus on manufacturing operations, measuring outputs in terms of quality, cost, delivery, flexibility, product or technology, and customer experience. Incidentally, we are recording this webinar today, so it will be available for download or review subsequently. The main areas that are our capability are competitive strategy and management systems, new product introduction and lifecycle management, manufacturing operations and supply chain management. My role is mostly consultancy based. and it is related to general business improvement, lean implementation, and the tools and techniques that support that, and also quite crucially, management development and coaching. So there's a little bit of a bridge between my consultancy and training. And at this point, I'll hand you over to Stephen, who will take you through the rest of the business.
Okay, thank you, Ian. So in terms of training, I mean, back in the late 1990s, after Industry Forum had been established, IATF was formed, the International Automotive Task Force. And one of those members, there were 5 members, 5 national trade associations, was the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. And in that, they created a training division in each of those 5 arms to deliver training in specific subjects, and one of those subjects being IATF, in terms of the standard itself, how to train not only the certificate the industry. So in terms of that, IATF, Industry Forum, is the only UK provider with a license to provide training. We're also involved in terms of VDA. So VDA, the Germans have assessed and approved, again, our training in terms of being able to deliver on things like 6.3, 6.5. We do other standards such as ODET. We're also in the automotive supply chain, APIS, and the Japanese Institute of Productive Maintenance. So we've got quite a wide offering. And as I said, we're the only UK license provider for both IATF and VDA 6.3. So in terms of what we're looking at today, we're looking at the final clause of the standard. So why is continual improvement right at the end of the standard? Yeah. So when we're looking at it, we're thinking about it, and we're trying to understand why place it right at the end. Why is it the final clause? When you think about the purpose behind ISO 9000 was based a lot on the plan, do, check, act cycle. So when we look back at the original intent, the principles behind the standard, it was to adopt the Deming cycle, as it's known, of plan, do, check, and act. And the final part is the act, and that's where the continual improvement sits, in terms of basically after we've done what we've set out to do in terms of planned. We go away, we manufacture in terms of we create the parts in terms of design, purchasing to buy the parts, then we manufacture the parts. From that, we need to check not only the parts themselves, but check in terms of our performance, make an assessment, and from that, where do we need to continue to improve? Where could we do things better? If you think about this logically, this bit of the standard is about the organisation. Most of it's focused on the customer, but the continual improvement is there to, can we improve on what we do? Can we make our business more efficient? Can we make our business more effective in terms of what we're offering? So if we start looking at the actual clause in ISO 9000, it states the organisation shall continually improve and suitably, adequacy and effectiveness of the quality management system. So in ISO 9001, it has a requirement to look at continual improvement, to consider continual improvement based on the results and analysis of the evaluation from the outputs of our processes. So basically, we're looking at that. We're going to do it through management review and decide how and what could we improve on. Yeah. So we're looking for those opportunities. We want to know that as a business, we can actually start thinking about how can we improve. So when we think about it, where does it actually sit in terms of where we're looking for continual improvement in how we've defined it as part of our quality management system? So we need to identify, basically, according to IATF, where does our continual improvement sit? There's a requirement to have a documented process. So when we think about a documented process, there's several clauses of the standard where there's a requirement for a documented process. And a lot of those processes will sit in a particular area of a business. So if you look at these document processes, I think there's 4. in purchasing, if you like, in clause 8.4, and it has a natural home. It has somewhere where it would sit. When we look at some of the design clauses, again, there's requirements for documented process. Well, product safety is probably going to sit in our new product introduction into our actual design process, our new products, our development processes. So we're thinking, well, where does continual improvement actually sit? Should it be its own individual process, or could we combine it into another process? Could we think about putting it into a manufacturing process, the quality process? Where does it actually sit? So when we're looking at it and we're asking the question, and we go to the frequently asked questions, one of those questions is it acceptable to document multiple processes into one documented process? So that's what I'm talking about when we're talking about putting the, purchasing related clauses into a purchasing process, or design into the design processes, the manufacturing clauses into manufacturing. But we've got to sit and think, where does continual improvement actually sit? How have we defined continual improvement? And because it's a process, and you look at the definition of a process into ISO 9000, it's got to have an owner. So basically, we need somebody who is responsible for continual improvement in the organisation, somebody with management responsibility to actually own a continual improvement process. And from that, it also needs an input in terms of a requirement. So what would be the requirement for continual improvement? What as an organisation have we decided we need to continually improve on? And what targets, what outputs are we going to look for from the continual improvement? How are we going to measure this process? How are we going to look for success factors in the process? What do we need to consider as part of continual improvement that we actually want to get delivered from it? So we've got to think, where does continual improvement sit in our organisation? Where in our organisation would we place continual improvement? Does it need to be separate? Does it need to be a support process in terms of like IT or HR? It's supposed to support every process in the organisation. So it is a difficult question in terms of when you look at the clause, where are we going to actually align continual improvement into our business? And another question is, where would we audit continual improvement in terms of the process? So it's a clause, it's a requirement. Where would we think about auditing continual improvement when we come to do an audit? Is it in every process? Is it, is there a defined process for continual improvement? That's what we need to establish, but we need to understand, how are we going to audit it? What are we looking for in terms of continual improvement? How has it been defined in terms of inputs? What are the outputs? What are the success factors of the process? And are they being managed in a reasonable fashion? Is there an action plan to achieve targets? So these are some of the questions that IATF throws up, and these are some of the questions that we've actually got to think about. How are we going to manage this? So we've already talked about basically where does it sit in terms of continual improvement, so where does it sit in our organisation? So should we have an individual process? What should we be thinking about in terms of where does continual improvement need to be in an organisation? So if you look at the clause and you go into the clause of the standard, it talks about what the documented process should contain. And the first point that they make is that we need to have some form of methodology in terms of how we're going to do continual improvement. So what does that mean? What do we mean by methodology? So in terms of methodology, we need to actually adopt some sort of system or method by which we're going to implement continual improvement. So things like TPM, Six Sigma, Kaizen, Lean, these are all certain tools or methodologies that we could adopt to actually bring about the principles of continual improvement, and how we're going to bring those into our system. So all of these are core tools that we could be using in terms of how are we going to actually manage continual improvement. So we need to think about which one we're going to use, how are we going to use it, where are we going to use it is another key question we've got to ask. Who is going to own it? Who is going to manage the process? what do we want from the process, and what do we want delivered from the process? So these are all key questions that we should be thinking about, and we should be planning what we're going to do about continual improvement. So if I hand back to Ian, Ian will go through some of the requirements in terms of some of the methodologies, as well as some of the requirements of IATF itself.
Thanks, Stephen. When we looked at the clause, obviously sitting towards the end of the IATF 16949 document, I contacted our colleagues in the oversight office to get their thoughts on, what was the rationale and the reasoning behind clause 10.3 and 10.3.1. And they put me onto the AIAG IATF rationale publication, which is available. And it states the following. It states that the 16949 supplemental requirement for an organisation to have a vigorous and active continual improvement process within its quality management system is intended to create a culture that is focused on the most effective, efficient and productive way of working towards the ultimate goals of customer satisfaction and long-term success of the organisation once the processes have been stabilised and demonstrated to be capable. The entire standard is based on identifying, managing and reducing risk. Continuous improvement comes from an engaged workforce and processes that identify not only failure modes, but also better ways of doing things that are already compliant. The closer all products are to standard, the lower the risk that non-compliant products will be made. It is always possible to do something in a better, less costly way with higher quality, better timing, predictive versus corrective, etc. The greatest asset in any company is its employees with ideas, knowledge, and creative thinking to improve the system, process, or situation for each employee. Those improvements will generally lead to improvements in the whole organization. Now, it's interesting that they pick up a few different bits and pieces in here. So the bits that we're going to come back to is this kind of idea of a vigorous and active continual improvement process. We're going to look at, we're going to discuss a little bit about the culture. We're going to talk about how we can assess an engaged workforce, and also this point that obviously the greatest asset in any company is its employees. It also goes on to say, in terms of the value add, that continual improvement is the linchpin in a quality management system that holds it together and continually assesses the ways in which every element of it can contribute to improved customer satisfaction through improvement of products, process efficiency, effectiveness, productivity, and ultimately the organization's profits. Without continual improvement as an integral part of the quality management system and culture of the organization is likely to experience customer satisfaction, high and potentially uncontainable costs of quality, and a loss of business and long-term viability as a result. Continual improvement might be incremental or initially slow to influence the organization, but its effects will compound and grow, leading to long-term permanent added value that is often greater than so-called quantum improvements. Picking up on the key bits there, that bit in the middle, without continual improvement as an integral part of quality management system and the culture of the organization, ultimately the organization's long-term viability is questionable. So if we pick up on a couple of little bits and pieces from that, the vigorous and active continual improvement process. How do we demonstrate that our continual improvement process is vigorous and active? Well, ultimately, most businesses will have some kind of strategy that it employs. That strategy will have some kind of action plan. That action plan will be followed, and the idea is that it will drive results in terms of typically quality, cost and delivery, but not forgetting health, safety and environmental impacts as well. So what would we be looking for in that? We would be looking for some kind of strategy and some kind of documented process, actions and results that can demonstrate to anybody looking that we are serious about this. Who owns the process? Good point. Stephen made it earlier. If you fall into the situation where possibly if the process is considered to be owned by everybody, does that mean that nobody owns it? Nobody does it. Everybody thinks everyone else is doing it. ultimately, you might want to consider a RASIC or a RACI type approach to this. Who's responsible? Who's accountable? Who supports? Who's informed? Who's consulted? But the key thing there is that, the responsible person, and it needs to be at the very top of the organization. These are the people who will make the decisions on strategic improvements. They will be the person who has control of the relevant resources that might be required in order to make these improvements possible. But they are not necessarily the people who will be driving it themselves. That will be delegated to lower levels within the organization. Should we have a formal continual improvement resource? Should it be dedicated? I think this, it depends on the size or type of the business. I think if you're working in a business that's got less than 50 people, the chances are you don't have somebody in the structure that is a continuous improvement or business improvement manager. If you're in a business that's got 200 to 300 people or more, it's likely there will be some kind of resource that is directly or indirectly focused on delivering business improvement. But I think you've also got to be very mindful of the aim. I started my career in a wonderful business on the South Coast, aerospace and defence manufacturer. It was fairly traditional. It had a very hierarchical structure. And generally speaking, within that hierarchical structure, if somebody's job was, let's say, quality manager, then people would look at it and go, that's one less thing for me to worry about. That's obviously their role. And the same can be true within a business improvement or continuous improvement resource as well. So you've got to be mindful. Initially, that person is there or is in place to understand the strategy, provide training, provide resource in order to make things happen, provide expertise. But ultimately, continuous improvement is not their job. The continuous improvement needs to be driven to a local level, driven to local operations managers, supervisors, production managers, team leaders, even down to the guys and girls at the sharp end. So be mindful. If you do have somebody in the business whose responsibility is continuous improvement, that responsibility should be to create the environment where continuous improvement can happen, not necessarily be responsible for doing it. And I think ultimately we need to go from an event-driven to a systematic process. So typically when we start the continuous improvement process, there'll be focused events, cross-functional teams performing Kaizen events. But ongoing, we need to kind of reduce the impact of event-driven activities and drive it to more of a systematic thing where it becomes a way of life. Very much in the same way as the final phase of workplace organization, 5S or 5C, is either the sustainability or the customer practice. This is when it becomes a way of life. We do it without thinking about it. We do it because it's the right thing to do, not because we're being reminded to do it on a daily basis. Intent, create a culture. Continuous improvement comes from an engaged workforce. The greatest asset in any company is its employees. Well, you can always rely on Dilbert to take the pulse of the situation, and we can see here that we've been saying for years that employees are our most valuable asset. Turns out they were wrong. Money is our most valuable asset. Employees are ninth. Wonder what eighth was? Carbon paper. I remember those days. Carbon paper is still pretty cool, and my kids still love the stuff. So it's it's very good. But ultimately, in order to create this culture, how do we understand what a culture is? Typically, most businesses will have an idea of what their culture should be or wants to be, but that is often different to where it is. Where do you start? It's based on the values of your organization. You define your values, you live and you breathe them. And it's really, really important. Here at Industry Forum, our values are professionalism, integrity, passion, innovation, and collaboration. And, ultimately, with these sorts of things, we need to recognize and reward when people display the correct behaviors in line with our values, and we deal with times when they don't. That's really, really important. It's about, walking the walk, as well as talking the talk. How do we know if our workplace is engaged? Well, there's statistics you can look at. If your employee turnover is high, there's every likelihood that that could have an impact on the engagement of your people. Looking at feedback that can be gained through appraisal systems, one-to-ones, team meetings, those kind of bits and pieces. Do people feel valued within your organization? It's a big question, and ultimately the workplace is a competitive environment. The best companies want the best people, and the best people want to go to the best companies. Simply paying good wage is not enough to guarantee the long-term viability of good people. The job of a business is to identify good people, recruit them, and then turn them into great people. That's the fundamental job of any business. In terms of 10.3.1, a manufacturing process improvement action plan with emphasis on the reduction of process variation and waste. So how are we trying to improve manufacturing in terms of identifying variation that could lead to waste, such as statistical analysis, improved identification, set up scrap? How has this been defined, and what actions have been defined in the progress in line with the overall objectives? So referring back to the methodology, this obviously, when you're talking about identifying waste and reducing variation, it very heavily influences lean characteristics and Six Sigma. Lean is principally about understanding value in the context of the customer and making it flow, and Six Sigma is about identifying and reducing variation. Both very much trying to achieve the same aim using a different suite of tools in order to achieve it. And obviously within the lean side of things, there is the Kaizen activities, there is the TPM aspect, there is the value stream mapping aspects as well. So there's a whole tranche of things. So ultimately, within this manufacturing process improvement, the action plans will be there, led from the top with the strategy, with the responsibilities delegated throughout the organization to make sure this stuff actually happens. Last bit, I'll hand back to Stephen before we'll open up for any questions.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, I mean, just following on really from the manufacturing part, I mean, when you're thinking about auditing, I mean, when we go to audit the manufacturing, that is certainly one of the questions we could ask: what continual improvement activities are here? What, how have continual improvement actions been defined? Are they continual improvement actions, or are they corrective actions? So again, that's going to be something where, the question we could ask: are you doing this just to resolve an issue, which again is a requirement, or are we looking at this in terms of this is something we feel we could improve upon, we could make better, we could actually design the process better in terms of what we're doing? And again, we should be learning lessons not only from corrective actions but from continual improvement. Is it something we could read across to other processes? Is something we could read across into other areas of the business that we're in terms of how could we make things better? How can we not only make it better, but how can we measure the success of what we're going to do? So what KPIs can we put against continual improvement? A big question. And in the manufacturing, we've probably already got those measures there. Things like OEE could be something that we're looking at. We want to improve on OEE. So how are we going to think about that? What are we going to look at in terms of improving on it? Could that then relate into maintenance in terms of, improved maintenance planning, improved reliability and measures into the maintenance, such as, mean time between failures, mean time to repair. And again, using the data to drive the continuing improvement, so we can actually demonstrate continuing improvement. We've got, good measures in place that actually show, how we've actually achieved something in terms of what we've looked at. So we've got to think long and hard, and manufacturing, we should have somewhere in the manufacturing process where we're looking to continue to improve. And again, like Ian said, we could be looking at things like lean. We could be thinking, well, how can we better organise the workplace, not only to, improve the flow, but maybe even to improve the quality. If we could improve the identification in terms of the location of parts, location of tools, location of equipment, all of these things could be, the way in which we're going about it, go back to, we're going back really to talking about the methodology in which the methodology we're going to use. How are we going to use it? How are we going to plan? And another big question that comes out of that is, how are we going to train in terms of the methodology we're going to use. Are we going to adopt something like lean? How are we going to train it? How are we going to make that culture that Ian was talking about? So again, thinking about how do we implement continual improvement is a very, very big question. But it's one necessary for any organisation, because we've got to be thinking how are we going to meet this particular requirement? But the requirement is for us. It's to satisfy us. It's to make us more efficient, make us more effective. So we always got to think about those, like, what we're going to do about it. So we get to the final part really, which talks about C, or clause 10.3.1 is C. And in there, it talks about risk analysis. And that's with a lot of the standard. Every time I use the word risk analysis in brackets after is such as FMEA. So what they mean by this is FMEA is going to be key in terms of, we're thinking about potential failure modes. Yeah, we're always thinking about what could potentially go wrong in the process. And again, should this be part of continual improvement? Well, yeah, absolutely. It's not the overall methodology we could use. We've got to think about FMEA as really, when we make changes, when we, understand something better, we've learned a lesson, and the FMEA is where we should actually deposit all of these lessons that we've learned in terms of the way we've improved something. Yeah, both through corrective action, but through any continual improvement activities that we've done. And when we suggested doing a webinar, as always, I trawled through all the customer specific requirements, and there was a couple with actual requirements against this clause 10.3.1. And in both of them, they were looking specifically at FMEA and what we should be doing about FMEA. So in terms of the General Motors one, this is talking about requires an annual review of the most critical items and the progress of actions. Because when you think of FMEA, the right-hand side of the FMEA, the optimization, as it's called in the newer version, is all about what actions do we have in place to improve on the situation in terms of what we've done through our analysis. So if you like, this is continual improvement. We've identified a potential weakness. We're adopting the actions to look at how can we improve it. We've got to reassess it, risk analysis it, to go back to, is it successful? Has it been successful? But it talks in there not just a review of corrective actions, but also a review of terms of, is there any potential issue in there that we could now identify? And maybe it's better understanding of a particular failure mode that we've identified, or maybe it's a new failure mode we've identified. And that might be down to new technology, a new process, something in the business. Can we improve upon it? So the FMEA is always key in an IATF organisation in terms of what we should be using it for, and using it as part of continual improvement again is key, because as with if we've got a concern or a corrective action, the definition a lot of the time when we go back or when we try to identify the problem, we should be using the FMEA to understand what have we defined already. And likewise with continual improvement, going back and trying to identify what have we identified in terms of the process, what could we do, what have we analysed, is that right, could we improve upon it? So we've got to look, this is General Motors approach. When we go to Stellantis, this requires a proactive approach for a reverse FMEA. So looking back and understanding what was already in the FMEA, what have we learned since? How can we use that in terms of elements of continuing improvement? So similar to General Motors, but going back, reviewing it, understanding it. What do we know better now? How can we use the FMEA in terms of the definitions that we've got? Do we need to answer some of those definitions in terms of the FMEA, and how can we improve upon them? So have you got anything else to add, Ian?
No, I think just before we kind of start looking at any questions that have come up, I think one of our roles within Industry Forum is to try and make sure we understand the challenges that the UK businesses, and particularly the automotive supply chain, are faced with, and what can we do to support them with those challenges. And I think, it's very difficult. None of us have crystal balls, but I think it's if we look forward, the future of manufacturing is likely to include less people and more automation. Now, that has an impact because it's going to be probably less people, but those people are going to be more capable and more flexible and more qualified, higher skill levels, and the automation that and the machinery and the equipment they interact with will become more and more complex. So, from our perspective, it's about trying to prepare for the workforce and the leaders of tomorrow to help deal with that. So that's right the way from recruitment through to development of internal capabilities and knowledge, focusing on sort of production operations managers, supervisors, leaders, the kind of pressures that these guys are under. I think if I remember when I was working with an organization being audited 20 years ago, it was a terrifying experience. You felt that the auditors were coming in to try and trip you up and sort challenges out. But we need to see this as an opportunity to assess where we're at and what we can do to improve. That's what we have to do. The whole concept of the ISO 9001, the 16949 is fundamentally around the plan, do, check, act cycle, and the check bit is an audit. That's where we're at, and then when we get the feedback from the audit, hopefully it's not too bad. But even if it is, that's where we've got to get better. And how do we fix that into our process going forwards? So with that kind of concludes the formal aspect of the webinar. Questions?
We've got one question from Jules. Do we have to have a continual improvement manager?
Again, yeah, we get asked this a lot, and I think it's really difficult because it's almost the irony is almost that continuous improvement from a lean perspective is about understanding where value exists and making it flow within the organization. So, when you start looking at where value happens within the organization, it's the guys and girls at the sharp end who are converting the raw material or purchase parts into something that you can add value to and sell. And typically, a continuous improvement manager wouldn't necessarily add value to that process. The way they do add value is their role needs to be the resource, the center of excellence that can initially drive activities, make improvements for people to see things happening, but ultimately to develop the knowledge and capability of everybody up and down the organization, from the management team down to the supervisory team and the guys and girls on the shop floor. So instead of having one person looking for improvements within the organization, you've got every set of eyes and all of that knowledge and experience and capability to engage with your workforce. So you don't have to have one. Like I said, I think if you're in a business that's got 20 to 30 people or less, it's unlikely you will have, but you will need access. And typically in a smaller business, people wear many hats. So you might have somebody who's a bit more specialist in that. But as the organizations get bigger, a couple of hundred people, you can expect to see a business improvement resource. But again, make sure that the responsibility for the implementation of business improvement doesn't sit with those people. It sits with the local ownership of the operations team or whoever is responsible for the performance in that area. So they are a resource. You don't have to have a manager, but it's really helpful to have access to some kind of expert. What we got?
Okay, another question. Certain tools are needed for different problems. Do we need to define each tool that will be used within the business? Would we be marked down for using a tool that is not in our documents?
So I'll say that one if I may. So when you're talking about no, not particularly. I mean, you do have to have a methodology. That's the bit he's talking about. Define the methodology that you're going to use. So you could have several tools in terms of that. And for most continuing improvement, they're going to feed into one another in terms of what we're doing. It doesn't, and I can't find anywhere in any customer specific requirement, anyone who actually defines this is the methodology you've got to be using. Yeah, we've got to put into there, the core in terms of what we're using, but that's going to adopt other tools in terms of the way you're looking at continuing improvement. So you'll be thinking, if you're adopting lean, does Lean include the elements of Kaizen into it? Yeah. So when you're thinking about it, or if you're adopting something like Six Sigma is built up of many tools. So no, I wouldn't see that anyone would come in and mark you down because you've not necessarily identified the tool in which you know, a different tool that you're using. As long as you can demonstrate that you've actually got a continual improvement process, the key overriding, you know, tool that we're going to use, something like Lean, something like Kaizen, something like Six Sigma. Yeah, this is the core tool that we're using, but we're using other tools to support that big high level methodology. That's the way I would look at it. I certainly couldn't see anyone marking you down saying, well, no, you should have actually adopted that. Okay.
Thanks, Stephen. Got another question come in. If IATF recommends FMEA tool to perform the risk analysis, does that mean that the expectation to have continuous improvement activities only in manufacturing and not in other processes like sourcing, HR, IT, etc.?
So
that one, yeah, if you want.
Yeah. Again, no, I mean, continuing improvement, as I said earlier, I mean, where do we think about continuing improvement? It could be one of those support, I mean, it is a support process when you think of it overall. So something like IT and HR, document control, whatever, you're looking at in terms of support process, that could be supporting everyone. There is a specific requirement to use FMEA in terms of a risk analysis, and that risk analysis should be driving actions, yeah? I mean, far too often you look at an FMEA, no action, no recommended action. So there's nothing to improve upon after we've done our risk analysis. So when you think about that as a question, you know, why did you bother to do the risk analysis if there's no output from it? So we should be thinking what actions we have. FMEA is there as part of a risk analysis, as part of an input to think where can we continue to improve upon. You know, we know about the risks in the business because we've done the risk analysis, we've done the FMEA. So it doesn't only have to be in manufacturing, it could be in other areas. In terms of, if you link it to the clause above, yes, we definitely do need to have some form of continual improvement in manufacturing. Yeah. That's what the clause says above. That's what B states. So yes, we do need to think about continual improvement in manufacturing, but we do definitely need to think about continual improvement in all areas. Yeah, even in, you know, if you're thinking about purchasing, one of the requirements in purchasing is the improvement of the suppliers. Yeah, the development of the suppliers in terms of bringing those on. So if you go back to purchasing itself, there's a clear requirement there. So again, continue to improve on the supply chain to support a supply chain to get to, you know, your ultimate goals to improve upon the business.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, manufacturing tends to be one of the focal areas for it, but the purpose of the relationship between a supplier and a customer is to supply a particular part.
Yeah.
The manufacturer of that particular part. So clearly the initial focus is probably in that area because that's one of the areas where you've probably got the most influence and ability to do something. Yeah. But you're completely right. I mean, procurement, sourcing, HR, IT, all of those support activities will help, could potentially help ease the process of converting the raw material to the finished goods and supplying it to the client. So manufacturing is a very important part, but it's certainly not the only part. Second part of this question is it mandatory to have a set of KPI for continuous improvement process? Well, it's a little bit chicken and egg. I think it's certainly you have to have a set of KPIs because if you don't measure something, you don't know what you need to A, focus on, and B, the impact of any improvement activities. But you don't have KPIs to purely for a continuous improvement process. You have KPIs to understand what's happening within the business. We always used to say from a quality, cost and delivery perspective, if you get those aspects of your business wrong enough for long enough, you'll go out of business. If you get your health, safety, environmental bits wrong, they'll shut you down. So it's there. You need to understand what's happening within the business. You have KPIs to help tell you that, and you apply improvement methodology in order to demonstrate improvements within the key performance indicators, which ultimately are the reason you do it is to try and make more money.
Yeah.
3, if the focus of manufacturing process is to improve FTQ to reduce scrap, it means that this is not a continuous improvement, correct? Since the standard asking to apply CI on statistically capable processes, this is not easy, as priority will be in the company to reduce FTQ, scrap, customer complaints, etc.
Oh, yeah, maybe one.
Jump in, yeah.
I mean, when you're looking at that, I mean, if you're looking at any KPI and any KPI we're not actually achieving, we should have some form of action plan, and then that action plan needs to be an improvement. So it is an improvement. Yeah, it is continual improvement in terms of what are we going to do. If we've got, you know, something like first time quality as an actual requirement when we're looking at that, we're making elements of corrective action, but how are we going to get to the ultimate goal? What have we done to define in our action plan? Because again, it is an improvement. When you think about it, if we're going from 500 ppm down to 5 ppm, how are we going to get there? Yeah, we've got to make some sort of plan, but we've got to work out how can we improve on that particular characteristic. So by definition, it's a point of improvement. It's the whole emphasis is to actually improve, plan, do, check, and then act. So when we've got the data, what actions have we got in place to actually improve on our performance? And that's what we want to do all the way through. But we can't just say reduction in scrap is our methodology. It's got to be, you know, what is the mechanism by which we're going to try and improve that? How are we going to try and improve it? What's the culture we're going to use to try and improve upon that?
Okay. Got another question come in. Similar theme. CI applies to every area of our business. Should we have a general procedure listing the tools we use for CI, or is it good enough to show proof of what we're doing, e.g., reducing scrap, training, etc.?
So, I mean, when we're looking at IATF, I mean, as I go back to it, there is a requirement for documented process. So if you're talking along the IATF, then you need to have something documented to say what are we actually going to do. And we've been through those 3 points. Yeah, we're going to have a documented process for it. The process should define the methodology. We should be focused on the manufacturing, and we should consider our risk analysis, such as FMEA. So when you were looking at it, we do have to have something documented, but it doesn't have to be documented for every process. That's the whole point. Where is continued improvement in our organisation? What is it we adopt in terms of continued improvement, the methodology? Are we focused on what we're making, and have we done any risk analysis in terms of the actions we're taking? So that's really what that one's talking about. Yeah,
and I think it's important, isn't it? Because we don't want the policy to be restrictive in terms of what we can and can't do to improve the process.
No.
So because you don't mention Lean or Six Sigma, you know, I don't want you to feel that because it's not mentioned in the quality management system means it's a no-go area and you can't do it, because ultimately you apply the tools and techniques that best suit your business and the challenges that you're facing. So the next question that's come in is quite a good one that leads on from that, is where or when would I audit my own internal continual improvement process? And I think, you know, before I hand over to Stephen on that one, the way in which, you know, we've said that it needs to be owned and led from the very top. And it's important that they do that because it sends the right message, and they also are they're in the position to see the impact of any improvement activities and the profit of the business, but also they are in the position to allocate the resources that might be needed in terms of investment, in terms of either time or energy or finances in order to realize these improvements. So when you have it, you might want to think about referencing kind of a RACI or a RASIC type document, which basically makes it very clear who does what, and where the responsibility, the accountability, the, you know, who is involved, who's consulted, who's supporting. Those kind of things are quite useful to go through, because it makes people think about the whole kind of process and how it's actually going to work, and also makes very clear what their roles and responsibilities are within them.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from an IATF perspective, it's where have you defined it? So where have you defined it? How have you defined it? If it's a separate process, then you would need to give time in your audit schedule, your audit plan, to actually think about, well, I've got to look at the continual improvement process. You know, yes, you'd be auditing it, if you like, as a standalone process in that instance, But what you'd be looking at is basically how have you defined the continuing improvement, the methodology, etc. All of that would be going into a single audit. If there's no, separated out process, then you're probably going to ask the questions each time you go to do an audit. So certainly with the senior management, you'd be talking to them about the improvement. You'd also be looking at, as part of management review, one of the inputs is to look at improvements to the quality management system, and to, the outputs is for improvements of the quality management system. So when we're looking at, it's all areas of the standard that we could actually look, and where the word, for improvement, we've mentioned purchasing, maybe ask them, what continuing improvement are you doing with your suppliers? Yeah. So there's lots of areas in the standard that we could pick up from and actually utilise into our audits.
Great. Another question has come in, is could FMEA be my methodology? I think FMEA is certainly a methodology that we would encourage the use of, but probably on its own, it's necessary but insufficient.
Yeah, I mean, when you read it, it talks about, point C is your risk analysis such as FMEA. So FMEA wouldn't really be, could it be a methodology? It's really looking at how have we actually adopted it, yeah? So when we're talking about it, and when we're thinking about what do we want from the outcome of the FMEA. So again, I think that's something people don't really think about. It's just literally, I've got to get an FMEA done, because that's what the requirement is. So therefore, we have a document, we've created a document, there it is. What actions we got from it? None, yeah? So when we're looking at that, it's not really being used. But in terms of the true intent of this, the reason FMEA is at the end of there is to think about it in terms of how or what have we influenced, in terms of what have we changed. If we've made any changes,
really important.
Captured.
It's a live document. Yeah. It's not one of those things you put a tick in the box. Well, we've done that. We can move on to the next. And I think that's something that was reinforced to me over the last couple of weeks. Is if as a business you have made some changes and you have made improvements, it's really important to go back and review the content of the FMEA, because if you've made changes, hopefully positive changes, they will have an impact in there, and it needs to be updated and recorded. Similarly, if you're undergoing a challenge or a problem or an issue within the shop floor, it's really important to cross check and back and say, did my FMEA see this? Did we recognise this as a problem? And if so, what should we have done in order to deal with it? Did it work? Didn't it work? Go back and actually look at this and understand whether the FMEA is doing what it needs to do, which is to protect the customer.
Yeah, so the answer to the question really is, the FMEA should be there to help support in terms of the continuing improvement process. It's something that we should actually be using to support the process, continuing improvement. How have we captured lessons, How have we captured greater knowledge in terms of our manufacturing processes? Okay. So don't think we've got any further questions. We can't see any more questions in the chat. But from myself and from Ian, we'd just like to thank you all very much for taking your time out to go listen to us sort of drone on about continuing improvement.
We could do this all day. I mean, if you've got the afternoon free, Stephen and I, we could do this all day.
Yeah. So talking about continuing improvement, our passion for it. Yeah.
Also, massive thanks to Kirsty to helping two grumpy old men get through a technological challenge that is this. So thank you very much for your time. We're here to help. Our business is about helping people understand and address challenges that stop them from being the best businesses they can. So don't be a stranger. Get in touch. It's good to talk, as Bob Hoskins used to say. Probably still does. But other than that, have a very enjoyable Friday afternoon. If you have links to the US, happy Independence Day, and have a great weekend.